my name is Sarah Donovan, and this is our third session in the series about curriculum for Nick's Impact. So I'm really excited to get to share this session about globalizing the curriculum with you, as this session is definitely my favorite. My passion is definitely curriculum and assessment, and it's where I like to have fun. So we've talked about triple track strategies in our prior two sessions, and so we're going to begin today again by looking at our learning objectives. And we have three objectives for our time together. The first is looking at ways students may be impacted by an American-centric curriculum. We're also going to look at defining culturally responsive teaching, and then we're going to consider ways to modify lessons and units to make them more relevant to students in an international school classroom. As we did in our session about culture matters, I want to begin by making sure that we have a common definition of what culture is. And so the definition we're using is that culture is an integrated system of learned behavior patterns that are characteristic of the members of a given society. Culture refers to the total way of life of particular groups of people, and it includes what a group of people thinks, says, does, and makes. It's a system of attitudes and feelings. And perhaps most importantly, culture is learned and transmitted from generation to generation. I want to remind you that we're going to be looking at characteristics of different cultures, and we're using culture to make generalizations. And generalizations are designed to help us think about what we expect to encounter when we interact with either our own personal culture or other cultures. And these generalizations are frameworks, and it's very, very important to remind you here that a generalization does not mean it's true of every individual within a particular culture, and we have to keep that in mind. Stereotyping occurs when we make assumptions, which are often negative, about an individual or their culture based on those generalizations. And so when we talk about cultures, we can be talking about dominant cultures, co-cultures, subcultures, oppressed cultures. And in many of our Nick schools, it's important to remember that the dominant culture is American culture. And we're going to look today during our session at how that dominant American culture can show up in some aspects of our curriculum. So today's session is designed to get you thinking about how culture, and particularly American culture, is going to show up in your curriculum. Now, culture is something that's deeply ingrained in us, and like I mentioned, it's something that is transmitted from generation to generation. And it's important that we recognize that school is actually one of the primary ways in which we transmit culture to the next generation, because schools often reflect societies and the dominant cultures, and therefore are significant. There are significant differences among different nations' school systems and educational practices. And I think this reflection is something that's often overlooked. A school culture is going to look and feel different in Latin America than it is from East Asia, than it is from Southeast Asia, than it is from Europe, than it is from Africa, than it is from North America. And schools reflect that dominant culture. And so when we have to consider that schools reflect societies, our schools reflect American culture. And because our schools reflect their societies and our schooling experiences reflect their societies and cultures, we all have different expectations based on our culture of what we expect education looks like. And so every stakeholder in your school, whether it's an administrator, a teacher, a student, or a parent, has had different expectations for what school should look like based on their culture and upbringing. And they expect that that is going to be reflected in your classroom and in the international school classroom. So the parents who are sending their students to your school expect that you're a professional teacher of third culture kids, and that you can teach their child regardless of their cultural background or backgrounds. So we're going to begin our time in this session by taking a short pop quiz, and you may want a bit of scratch paper if you need to do some work. But I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and after each question, I want you to pause the video and look at the different answers, and then make your best guess. There's no keeping score of your pop quiz. This is just for you. And once you've answered the question, go ahead and hit play, and I will give the different answers. So question 1, how many seasons are there? All right, so go ahead, look at the answers, pause, make your answer, and then hit play when you're ready to hear the answer. So the correct answer here is actually, it depends on where you live. So I was teaching 5th grade science a couple of years ago, and the students were learning about ecosystems, predators, and invasive species. And the teacher was reading a book where the wolves from the island went to the mainland, and the ecosystem of the island is then affected, and the wolves eventually go back to the island, and everything comes back into balance again. But the book is written to tell this story over the course of 4 seasons, because in America, there are 4 seasons: fall, winter, spring, and summer. But while teaching, the teacher stopped and said, "How many of you know what seasons are?" Most hands went up, but there were a few students who didn't put their hands up. So the teacher had to stop and explain how that in America we have 4 seasons and what those 4 seasons are. But if in Thailand, when I was there, you had asked me how many seasons there are, the answer would have been 3 seasons: the hot season, the rainy season, and the cool season. And in Singapore, we really didn't have seasons. It was hot and humid and liable to rain 365 days of the year. So there was no reason in Singapore that you would ever have the weather app on your phone, because the weather didn't change. And so when we consider a question such as this, if you come from an American background, then you likely think that the answer is 4 seasons. But not all of your students are coming from that background, and so they actually may have different answers to this question. So my second question is a math question, and David's making a wall out of bricks. Each brick is 2/3 foot long. There are 20 bricks lined up end to end to make the wall, and what is the total length of the wall in inches? So go ahead, pause the video, do a bit of math, and then hit play when you're ready to come back for the answer. Well, if you grew up with the metric system, you probably didn't grow up in Liberia, Myanmar, or the US, which is where we use the US customary or imperial system. If you're from the UK, you've used a mix of systems. And for those of you who grew up with the metric system, when we talk about the idea of feet and inches, it probably doesn't make sense. And it's true. We use a base 12 system, and centimeters, kilometers is base 10, and so it's a lot easier, even I'll admit that. But measuring systems are a big deal because it's highly likely your math textbook is written using feet, inches, miles, ounces, pounds, and things like cups, pints, and quarts, and Fahrenheit. So your student may fully understand how to do the math, but the units in the word problem may throw them for a loop. So one important question to ask yourself is, what is this problem really assessing? Is this problem assessing addition, multiplication, knowledge of fractions, or unit conversion? And you need to make sure that you're testing what you really want to be testing. If you're in elementary school and doing the lesson on conversion, then these units and the ability to go between them is important. However, if you wanted to study fractions, then this problem probably isn't assessing what you think it's going to be assessing. All right, ready for the next question? We're going to do a bit of science here. So I want you to use what you know about the properties of matter to figure out how you could find a needle in a haystack. All right, so go ahead, hit pause, and then hit play when you're ready to hear the answer. All right, so I have to fully admit that the reason this question is even in here is actually my fault. So in 5th grade, our students study properties of matter, and students had a short assessment prop that actually gives this question. Except when we created this question, we didn't think about how some students wouldn't know what hay is or a haystack is until a student finally raised their hand to ask, what is hay? So in case you're wondering, you can either use a magnet or you can float the hay to find the needle. But you may have to remember that sometimes the vocabulary in our questions is what gets in the way of the question. And that brings me to our 4th question, which is a reading question. So I'm going to give you a moment to read the question, and then hit pause, come up with your answer, and hit play when you're ready to hear the answer. All right, so what's the correct answer here? It's to become motionless or paralyzed. But the problem I encountered with a question similar to this one wasn't about finding the meaning of the word frozen. So this question is actually based on a situation where I was doing map testing and a student raised their hand to ask, "What's this word?" as they pointed to the word inning. Baseball is a sport whose popularity is highly contextual based on where you live. And the student was so tripped up over not knowing what an inning was that she agonized over the right answer to the question, even though the question had absolutely nothing to do with the word inning. All right, question 5 is another math question. And so I'm going to give you a moment to read the question, hit pause, do a bit of math, and then hit play when you're ready to come back. All right, so the answer here is 6 quarters, 9 dimes, and 18 nickels. But in order to solve this, what information did you need to know? You needed to know the value of a quarter, a dime, and a nickel. That's right, because in America, we don't call them 25-cent coins, 10-cent coins, and 5-cent coins. How many of you are going to a place where they don't have quarters, dimes, and nickels? Many of you. How many of you will have kids in your classroom who have never been to the US? Every one of you watching this video. So this question is actually testing systems of equations and algebra. But if you don't know the American monetary system, you're sunk. As a high school math teacher, my first lesson every day, every year, every class, on the first day of the year was about the American monetary system because it's so pervasive in American math textbooks. Some of you will go to countries where they don't even have fractional coins. The coins are actually small whole numbers. So the reason that we've taken this quiz here is because I want you to begin to get an idea of all the things that you and I don't think twice about when we're planning our lessons, but that will actually trip your students up. So there are some common considerations to be aware of when you're using curriculum from the US that may not make sense to students who are in your classroom. Distance, miles, feet, ounces, etc. Most of the world runs on kilometers, meters, and so you need to consider distances and units. All right, monetary units like we just saw as well. The local monetary system may be very different from the US monetary system. Context. Oftentimes, for example, in the problem with the word inning, you needed to know what baseball was. You needed to know the context to even be able to read the question. And so sometimes students will get caught up on context because it's something that American students would know. But if you're outside of the US, you may not have experienced that particular phenomenon. Idioms. In America, we often use idioms that we assume everyone understands, such as, "I hit it out of the park." That's another baseball reference to being able to hit the ball out of the park. But if you don't know baseball, you probably won't know that reference. Jokes. One of the things that consistently does not translate between culture is humor. And so just because you may find it funny or it's supposed to be funny in a story doesn't mean that a student is going to understand that joke. Vocabulary. We can use different words. And so in the UK, we call a trunk a boot. And so we have different vocabulary that we use that even though it may even be in English, it's not vocabulary that we would use in different parts of the world. So keep that in mind. And worldview. We talked about this some in the culture section, that our culture very much impacts our worldview. And so students' worldview is impacted by the beliefs, the values, the perceptions, the behavior of the culture they've grown up in. It's very much shaped by their family's beliefs, their country's beliefs. And so keep in mind that worldview is something that students may be impacted by because their worldview, how they would answer a question, may not be how you would answer a question, but that doesn't mean that in how they've been raised, their answer was wrong. And so you've just got to be aware of what you're really assessing. Are you assessing what you really want to be assessing? Are you assessing the content? Or is the English or the American expectation and context inhibiting what you actually really want students to know? The reason that we want you to be aware of all those things is because your textbook, if there is one, is very likely imported from America or written from an American perspective if it's online. In fact, in 5 international schools, I've never once seen a published textbook used that was written in the host country outside of world language textbooks, or maybe they were written in the UK and very rarely Australia. But your textbooks are pretty much guaranteed to be written from a very American-centric perspective. And so what that means is that our American textbook perspective often looks a lot like this photo. The world is colored by our perspective. And to be more specific, it's not just colored by the American perspective, it's colored by the dominant American cultural perspective, and it gives little credence to the perspective of minority views, of cultures, of languages, and experiences. And that isn't to say that it's just our American textbooks that have that perspective, but for those of us who are Americans, this perspective is often deeply ingrained in us by how we were raised and educated. It was the culture that was passed to us through our education system, through our families, through our life experiences. I had a teacher show up in my office with some concerns about her social study curriculum a few years ago when I was in Singapore. And she had approached the elementary principal and I with her concerns that the activities for the curriculum, in her view, were not at all related to the standards. Now, I'll tell you that the social studies curriculum had been written in-house and it was not from an American textbook. And the decision had been made to write the curriculum locally because we couldn't find an elementary social studies program that was global in its view and would meet our needs. And we were using American standards written for international schools. And so we had to write the curriculum in-house so it was relevant to our students. Now, when the teacher came to talk to me, we were in our 4th year of implementing this curriculum. And the teacher came into my office, and the first thing that we wanted to address was her concerns that there were too many standards for a particular unit about society and identity. And I fully agreed with that. It was unrealistic to think that all of those standards could be covered in the necessary depth within the unit. Now, to give a bit more context, in the United States, in elementary school, you usually have a year devoted to state history where you do a big state history project and learn about the history of your state. In Singapore, we would do this in grade 3, but the project was devoted to Singapore. And so our grade 3 social studies curriculum that this teacher taught was entirely written so that students would learn about Singapore. Now, the teacher, we had already agreed that there were too many standards, but the teacher then started telling me about the standards that she thought that we should get rid of. And she was talking about how she didn't understand why there was a standard about tolerance and acceptance in the unit, or why we would be talking about tolerance and acceptance within a unit on ethnicity and culture. And one standard in the unit was about how different sociological circumstances, such as race, ethnicity, gender, and class, influence how individuals see the world. And these are all things that are so important. But I let the teacher go on for a little while about how the activities weren't tied to the standards and why those standards shouldn't be included. And when the teacher finished, I paused for a moment and I explained this. I said, I realize that this is your first year in Singapore, and so you may not be as familiar with Singaporean history and culture as those who wrote this curriculum who have all lived here for a few years. And one of the most important and foundational pieces of Singapore culture is about acceptance and tolerance. And almost every decision the government makes here is through the lens of equality and opportunity, regardless of race. And so one of the reasons mandatory national service exists in Singapore is racial and socioeconomic harmony. One reason the last presidential election had gone uncontested was ethnicity. Chinese were ineligible, that's 80% of the population, because Singapore had a rule that if a certain ethnicity had not had a president in the last 5 cycles, the election is reserved for someone from that ethnicity. So in 2017, no one of Malaysian ethnicity had been president in the last 5 years of the election cycle, so only Malays were eligible to run for the presidency. So while those standards may not seem important, they were actually the most important ones. And I was happy to help the teacher reorganize the curriculum to meet the standards, but we had to make really careful decisions about how we were going to change the curriculum. Just because something from our American worldview, our American understanding of the world doesn't seem important, doesn't mean that it's actually not one of the most important things in the host culture that you're living in. And I tell this story because it's not always textbooks that are written with a lens that may be different than the one required. Our background can very much influence and impact how we choose to teach different topics. And I would encourage you, as we've talked about through the first two sessions as well, to learn about where your students are coming from, to study the history, the values, and the culture of both your host country as well as the cultures represented by the students and families in your classroom, and also to actually study the history, values, and culture of your own culture as well. It's going to make you a much more relevant teacher, and you'll be able to better connect with your students. I also want to briefly talk about, if you're coming from the United States, the idea of the public school curriculum versus an international school curriculum and the expectations. Public schools often, because they're large and have many employees, have access to amazing resources. And if you've worked in a public school, particularly in a larger district, you've probably had your curriculum handed to you or at least mapped out for you. You may not have been tapped to serve on an accreditation committee, and you may or may not have had the opportunity to serve on a committee that reviewed textbooks or a committee that wrote curriculum for the district. If you've worked in a private school in the US, you've probably experienced some, if not all, of those things. But in an international school, it's really important to recognize that you as teacher are the one who writes curriculum. You use the resources, and you're the one who has to write the curriculum and the map. You'll be the one that works in Rubicon Atlas. You'll be the one who has to create or curate resources and assessments. You're going to have to discern whether or not a resource is well written, aligned to standards, and relevant to what you're trying to teach. If you have a team to share that workload, then that's awesome, and I always recommend the approach of divide and conquer the work. But one of the biggest shocks that's new to teachers from the US when they reach international school for the first time is the high level of expectation of your professional knowledge and ability to curate curriculum. There isn't someone else to do the work for you. It's going to be a part of your job. So what do we do about that? We take the social and cultural background that we have for granted when we're teaching in a classroom full of monocultural students. And in the US, we buy a curriculum and we use that curriculum. But internationally, you can't just buy the curriculum and use it. You may be able to buy the curriculum, but it's not necessarily going to fit the students that you have and the resources that you need for your classroom. When I was in Singapore, we had to write our own elementary Bible, social studies, and science curricula because we couldn't find programs that were relevant to our kids. Every international school I've worked in has had to write their own social studies curriculum. And so it means that it's really important that you have an underlying understanding of how we plan for student learning. And not just lesson planning, but also unit planning and how we map out what we want to teach over the course of the year. If you haven't read Understanding by Design by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, I would consider this to be the foundational text of how curriculum and units are designed with student learning in mind. Each of your schools is going to use some sort of backwards design for its curriculum mapping and its writing. And in addition to the book, there's also a professional development workbook that provides a lot of templates and examples of what backwards design looks like. And so while it may seem like an odd thing to really focus on, I highly recommend investing in this book and spending a lot of time reading it and learning about what it means to work through a understanding by design or backwards design framework for curriculum design. It's going to be one of the most valuable tools and resources that you have available to you as a teacher. If you have a lot of experience writing curriculum, then I'd recommend Global Perspectives. And it talks about teaching third culture kids. It talks about being an international school teacher. It talks about considerations for curriculum in international schools. And it talks about developing good assessment practices. And so if you're new to being in an international school, Global Perspectives is written through the lens of what all of this looks like in international schools. Two other books I would recommend would be Zaretta Hammond's Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, and then also Bridging Multiple Worlds by Lorraine Taylor and Catherine Whitaker. And the second book is a case study of diverse educational communities in the United States And they're not just related to culture. They look at diverse learning needs, they look at diverse socioeconomic status, um, and it has some wisdom that provides perspective on this work of bridging cultures, even though it's written from a US perspective. But I want to go back to that question of what do I do about my curriculum? We want to look at culturally responsive teaching as one avenue of how we can address diverse student populations. We need to allow students the ability to share their own culture and values, and culturally responsive teaching is a process of using cultural knowledge, prior experiences, and performance styles of diverse students to make learning more appropriate and effective for them. However, it's important to realize that culturally responsive teaching isn't just adding surface level cultural details to low level decontextualized activities that don't offer any cognitive challenge and don't build intellective capacity. And so, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look. Let's take this word problem. John goes to McDonald's and decides to buy 12 Big Macs. Each Big Mac costs $4. How much money did John spend? So this is a third or fourth grade elementary math problem that we might see in the United States. Now, you could change the problem so that it read that Susie goes to Xiaoyang's and decides to buy 12 shengjianbao, and each shengjianbao, which is a dumpling, cost 4 renminbi. How much money did Susie spend? Now, is this a bad change to make? Not necessarily, but is it making the learning more effective or appropriate for students? Probably not. It might be a bit more relevant to what they encounter in their daily lives, but to go back to the previous quote, it's a surface level change. This question and the change that we've made doesn't mean students were learning more or learning better because of the change that I made. It was just a surface level change. So what we consider is that we want to modify the problem, we want to modify the learning, and we want to make it relevant. And there are some ways that we can do that. The first way that we look at is choosing globally relevant literature. So choose literature that is culturally. So let's consider how we make learning more relevant to students in meaningful ways. The first is choose globally relevant literature. To be honest, this can be really difficult, but when you have the opportunity to choose literature for your classroom, choose literature that leads to bigger conversations. In elementary school, choose literature that helps students better understand their own culture or that provides deeper insight into the culture in which you live and it allows you to make comparison between cultures. I'd encourage you to try to choose literature from different cultures throughout the year so that you have a wide variety of students' cultures represented. You also want to choose culturally sensitive literature, and this is a really big deal in social studies and Bible. American-centric Bible curriculums are often not culturally sensitive in how they approach other religions, and the same could be said for how they approach social studies. As an example of this, a few years ago when I was working in China, we had to order new history books, and we finally found a history book that we wanted, but it came to us with about 15 pages that had been cut out by customs because they were deemed not appropriate. They were not deemed as being culturally sensitive. And so it was a reminder to us that when we consider choosing resources, they have to be culturally sensitive both to our host country and the students in our classroom. And we want to ensure that we're creating an inclusive environment for all of our students. The third thing that we can do to make student learning relevant is to provide cultural scaffolding. Asking students to research and learn about something cultural before you introduce it to them in class is very helpful. So for example, back to my quiz problem about finding a needle in a haystack, you could have asked students the night before to find out what a needle in a haystack means and have them come back and tell you and tell each other what they've learned. Begin by setting students up for success rather than allowing them to get stuck by cultural references they don't understand later on. You can also provide content scaffolding. And so a few years ago, I had a parent come to me. I was teaching math, and she was concerned because her daughters had been making A's in high school math in the United States, but now was making C's in Algebra 2. At our school, we didn't have an honors program, so every student had the potential to go on to the next level of math, and we taught with that expectation in mind. We had high standards for all of our students. And I remember this mom saying that all her daughter wanted to do was go to Bible college and become a missionary, and so why did math have to be hard? I remember when I was in Shanghai, we had to often have conversations with teachers about what it meant to be low, because teachers would refer to students as low, but they weren't. We just had a skewed sample of high achieving students. And just because a student is coming to you in fourth grade doesn't mean he's had the same standard and the same learning as the rest of your fourth grade students. For a Western family, math will be a hard transition point, I can guarantee that, but you have to provide content scaffolding. You need to make sure that when students come into your classroom that you are spending time with them talking about the background knowledge, talking about foundational knowledge. You need to scaffold content because the expectation that you have may be very different from the expectation where the student has come from, or it may be that the prior school that the student attended provided very different content or very different types of teaching than what your school is now providing. So make sure that you're differentiating and providing content scaffolding for students. Finally, two things you can do for making learning relevant to your students is changing the content and making it personally relatable. So when you're teaching science and it's talking about the Ohio wetlands, what can you do to make that relatable to your students? For us, we went and looked at the wetlands in Singapore, and we had students draw a comparison and actually take a field trip out to the wetlands. When you're teaching social studies and you're learning about a particular war, how can you change the content so your students are learning about war but in a way that's meaningful to them? Think about what it means for students to be able to take the material that you're teaching and see themselves reflected in it in a positive way. In addition to modifying problems and making them relevant, it's also helpful to teach students different cognitive routines that they can use, because part of what helps students learn is being able to see a bigger picture. And so there's some different types of cognitive routines that we use with our students. And the first is similarities and differences. And so when we talk about similarities and differences, we're asking students, how is this new material connected to what I already know? How is it similar to content that I already know? How is it different from what I've learned in the past? So ask students to make that comparison. We also use what we call a whole to part routine, which is that we ask students what are the natural relationships and patterns in the material that we're learning. And so how do we move from the idea of part of the relationship and how does it grow into everything that I'm learning? So you might think, for example, of a mind map. I have discrete topics, but how are they related? What are the patterns between them? And asking students to make those connections. It's very similar to the idea of relationships. How does all of this material fit together? What larger system is what I'm learning a part of? And so drawing relationships between different ideas. And finally, we consider perspectives. Whose point of view does this represent? So if you've gone through some of the worldview training with Annie Gallagher, one of the things that we talk about is we talk about whose worldview does this represent? And that's a really important question. Allow students to wonder, when I'm reading a piece of literature, when I'm looking at history, what exactly does that point represent? Whose view am I hearing? And what other views might there be? So students learn these cognitive routines. They help students make sense of new information in light of their prior experiences. And remember, those prior experiences aren't experiences that may lead students to be what we perceive as deficient. They're unique, and they're what makes students unique and should be viewed as strengths. And so rather than viewing students from a deficit point of view, think, what is it that my student knows and how can I use that and build upon that for their learning? So I talked a little bit about whole to part, and I just want to show that this is a good example of asking students to find natural relationships and patterns in the materials. I find sometimes whole to part is the hardest to think about, but you'll see that students have a lot of different topics on their post-it notes, and they're beginning to draw meaning between those using connector arrows to help them have a better idea of the whole picture. In addition to the cognitive routines, you can also use your classroom decor as a way to reflect student learning and help students see connections. And so you can make mind maps. Those mind maps are ways that students are able to engage in that whole to part thinking. All right. And when we consider our classroom decoration, we also might have anchor charts. Now, as a high school teacher, I'll be honest that I hadn't interacted a lot with anchor charts. But to be honest, anchor charts are really, really important for students, and they can help remind students of certain processes that you want them to learn. And so anchor charts can be really helpful. You can also think about, if you teach a vocabulary intensive course, making a word wall. This is extremely helpful for your ESL students. And my favorite word walls are ones that have words in English and then also have that same word translated into other languages that students in your classroom might feel comfortable with. So sometimes we latched onto an idea that students shouldn't use their mother tongue as they become fluent in English or are immersed in the language. But to be honest, that goes against what we know from research. The more fluent a student is in their mother tongue, the more it helps them in their second and third languages. And so having a word wall that allows students to make connections between English and their mother tongue language is going to be very helpful for the students. Let your students have a say in how you decorate your classroom. Let them design and choose some of the classroom decor that matches their cultures and allows them to learn about each other's culture. Ensure as well that your host culture is somehow represented in your classroom. When I lived in Shanghai, one of the pieces of feedback that was really insightful for us as a school was that when parents walked the hallways, even though we taught Mandarin, that every student was taking Mandarin class, even though we valued our host culture, you could walk through the hallways and you didn't see Mandarin decorations in hallways. You didn't see it in classroom. And so make sure that when your students walk through, that they see their own culture, but that they also see representation of the host culture. One thing that I think is really important that we did when I lived in Singapore was we translated our ESOs, or our school's core values, into Spanish and Mandarin. Those were the two courses that we taught, and so that in those classes, students saw those core values represented in the language that they were learning. So I know that that's a lot of different things to think about when we consider how students can be affected by an American-centric curriculum. We've briefly defined culturally responsive teaching. Again, I highly recommend Zaretta Hammond's book on that. And we've talked about just a few ways to modify your units or lessons to make them more relevant to students in an international school classroom. I recognize that, to be honest, this is barely scratching the surface. But I would recommend that you look into and dig into the various resources that we've talked about, such as Understanding by Design, such as the Global Perspectives book, such as the Culturally Responsive Teaching book, and really take initiative to learn about different ways that you can transform your classroom to make it relevant to students. So as we end our session today, I'm going to use my last triple track strategy that we've talked about, which is having some reflection questions. And so think about, for your curriculum, what are some things that you teach that may be difficult for students who don't understand or aren't from American culture? How does your own personal culture and background influence your teaching expectations and interactions with students? And so we've talked in prior sessions today about the different ways that our cultural expectations and backgrounds can influence education. And then think about how you can ensure that your classroom decor reflects the diversity represented in your classroom. So it's been my pleasure to be with you over these 3 sessions. As I've said, I wish that we had gotten to be together in person, but I truly do hope that you have a fantastic first year in your school, and I hope that at some point we'll get to meet in person. Have a great afternoon.